The frigid wind whipped across Fiona Zimmerman's face as the stagecoach barreled down the narrow mountain pass, its wheels creaking against the snow-packed trail that wound through the Sierra Nevada mountains toward Eldorado Canyon, Nevada. It was January of 1876, and the winter had been unforgiving, transforming the typically arid landscape into a treacherous wonderland of ice and snow. "How much longer do you reckon?" Fiona asked the driver, pulling her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. The last rays of sunlight were fading fast, casting long purple shadows across the pristine white landscape. "Not more than an hour, Miss Zimmerman," the driver called back, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "We'll cross Miller's Lake first. Should be frozen solid this time of year, then it's just a short stretch to Eldorado." Fiona nodded, sinking back against the leather seat. 6 months ago, she'd been teaching in a Boston schoolhouse, her life predictable and safe. Now she was heading to the Nevada territory to take up a position as the new schoolteacher in Eldorado Canyon, a growing mining town that had advertised for someone with her qualifications. The other passengers, a middle-aged merchant and an elderly woman returning from visiting family in Sacramento, had fallen asleep, lulled by the rhythmic swaying of the coach. Fiona envied their ability to rest. Her mind raced with thoughts of what awaited her in Eldorado Canyon. Would the children respect her authority? Would she find friends in this remote corner of the West? At 23, she had left everything familiar behind in pursuit of adventure and independence. The stagecoach began to descend toward what must be Miller's Lake. Through the frost-covered window, Fiona could see the vast expanse of white stretching before them. The driver slowed the horses as they approached. "Miller's Lake ahead," he announced. "Frozen solid every winter for as long as I can remember." Something in his tone made Fiona uneasy. She peered out the window again, studying the frozen surface. It seemed solid enough, glittering in the fading light like a sheet of diamonds. The horses' hooves clomped onto the ice, the sound different from the crunching snow of before. The elderly woman stirred. "Are we crossing the lake?" "I don't recall doing this before." "Trail's been snowed in," the driver called back. "This is safer than trying to navigate those drifts." Fiona wasn't convinced, but she kept her concerns to herself. The driver knew these routes better than she did. The stagecoach moved slowly across the ice, the horses' steps careful and measured. Then it happened. A crack, sharp as a gunshot, split the air. The elderly woman gasped. The merchant jerked awake. Fiona felt her heart drop to her stomach. "Everyone stay still." The driver shouted, but his warning came too late. Another crack, louder this time. The coach lurched. Fiona grabbed the leather strap above her head as the floor tilted beneath her feet. The horses whinnied in terror. "Jump!" The driver yelled, but before anyone could move, the ice gave way completely. The stagecoach plunged through the surface, ice and frigid water rushing in. The elderly woman screamed. The merchant lunged for the door, but it was jammed against a chunk of ice. Water rushed in through every crack and seam, rising rapidly around Fiona's ankles. "Help!" she shouted, banging against the window with her fist. "Someone help us!" The merchant managed to force open the door on his side, allowing him and the elderly woman to scramble out onto the fractured ice. But as Fiona moved to follow, the coach shifted again, sinking deeper. The door slammed shut, trapping her inside as water rushed in faster. "Miss," the driver called from somewhere outside. "Hold on." The water was at her waist now, shockingly cold, stealing her breath away. Fiona pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The window was her only hope. She pounded against it with all her strength, but the thick glass held firm. The stagecoach continued to sink, the water now at her chest. In moments, it would fill the coach completely. Fiona took a deep breath, preparing for the inevitable. Then she heard it hoofbeats thundering across the ice, followed by a man's voice shouting commands. Through the frosted glass, she caught a glimpse of a figure dismounting from a horse, moving with purpose toward the sinking coach. "Stand back," a deep voice commanded. Seconds later, the window beside her shattered in a spray of glass. A strong arm reached through, gripping Fiona's shoulder. "Take my hand," the man ordered. Fiona didn't hesitate. She grasped the outstretched hand, feeling calloused fingers close firmly around hers. With surprising strength, the man pulled her toward the broken window. The water was at her neck now, her sodden clothes weighing her down. "I've got you," the man assured her, his voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. Fiona pushed with her legs, propelling herself through the window opening. Sharp edges of glass tore at her dress, but she barely noticed. All that mattered was escaping the watery tomb the stagecoach had become. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, pulling her free of the coach just as it sank completely beneath the fractured ice. Fiona gasped for air, coughing and shivering violently as the man dragged her across the treacherous surface toward solid ground. Once they reached the shore, Fiona collapsed onto the snow, her entire body trembling uncontrollably. Through chattering teeth, she looked up at her rescuer for the first time. He stood tall against the darkening sky, his broad shoulders draped in a sheepskin coat now soaked from the rescue. A cowboy hat sat low on his brow, shadowing his features, but she could make out a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes as blue as a summer sky. "Xavier Zane," he said simply, removing his coat and wrapping it around her shaking shoulders. "Lucky I was riding by." Fiona tried to speak to thank him, but her teeth chattered too violently. Xavier knelt beside her, concern etched on his weathered face. "We need to get you warm," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "My cabin's not far." He looked toward the other survivors, huddled together on the shore. The driver was attending to the elderly woman while the merchant paced anxiously. "Jones," Xavier called to the driver. "You and your passengers all right to make it to town?" The driver nodded. "My horses made it to shore. Coach is lost, but we can ride double to Eldorado. It's just 3 miles now." Xavier turned back to Fiona. "You're in no condition for that ride. My place is closer. I'll get you warmed up, then take you to town tomorrow." Under normal circumstances, Fiona would have protested the impropriety of going alone to a stranger's cabin. But these were hardly normal circumstances, and the bone-deep cold was becoming dangerous. "Thank you," she managed to whisper as Xavier lifted her effortlessly into his arms and carried her to his waiting horse. "Hold tight," he instructed, mounting behind her and wrapping one strong arm around her waist to steady her. "It's not far." As they rode through the gathering darkness, Fiona leaned back against Xavier's chest, drawing warmth from his solid presence. Her last thought before exhaustion claimed her was that her arrival in the West had certainly been more eventful than she'd anticipated. The cabin materialized out of the darkness like a mirage, a solid structure of hewn logs with a stone chimney from which a thin trail of smoke curled upward. Xavier dismounted first, then reached up to help Fiona down. Her limbs felt leaden, her sodden dress frozen stiff in places. "Can you walk?" Xavier asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Fiona tried to step forward but stumbled. Without hesitation, Xavier swept her into his arms again and carried her toward the cabin door. "I'll see to the horse after," he explained, shouldering the door open. The interior was simple but unexpectedly cozy. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, casting golden light across a room that contained a wooden table with 2 chairs, a small kitchenette area, and a bed in the far corner. Pelts and blankets adorned the walls and floor, adding warmth to the rustic space. Xavier set Fiona down gently on a chair near the fire. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly. "I have some things you can wear." He moved to a trunk in the corner, rummaging until he produced a flannel shirt and a pair of woolen trousers. "They'll be too big, but they're dry," he said, placing them in her hands. "I'll tend to my horse. You change." With that, he strode back out into the night, closing the door firmly behind him. Fiona sat motionless for a moment, the borrowed clothes clutched to her chest. Her mind told her she should feel scandalized by the situation, but all she felt was gratitude for this stranger's straightforward kindness. With trembling fingers, she began to undo the buttons of her frozen dress. By the time Xavier returned, she had changed into his clothes, which indeed swallowed her slender frame, and had wrapped herself in a blanket she'd found folded on a nearby chair. Her wet garments hung from a line she'd strung near the fire. Xavier stamped the snow from his boots before entering. He nodded approvingly at her changed state, then moved to stoke the fire, adding several logs until it roared with renewed vigor. "You're the new schoolteacher," he said, his back to her as he worked. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Fiona confirmed, surprised. "How did you know?" "Small town," Xavier replied, turning to face her. "Word gets around. They've been expecting you for a week now." In the firelight, Fiona could see her rescuer clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so. His features were striking, a straight nose, high cheekbones, and those remarkable blue eyes that seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom. A scar traced a thin line from his left temple to his jaw, telling of a life that hadn't always been gentle. "I'm Fiona," she offered. "Fiona Zimmerman." "I know that too," Xavier said with a slight smile that transformed his serious face. "Like I said, small town." He moved to the kitchenette area, filling a kettle with water from a bucket and placing it over the fire. "You need something hot inside you," he explained. "Tea's the best I can offer." "Tea would be wonderful," Fiona said, her voice steadier now that warmth was returning to her body. "And thank you, Mr. Zane, for saving my life." Xavier shrugged, as if pulling women from sinking stagecoaches was an everyday occurrence. "Lucky timing is all." "I was heading back from checking my traps when I heard the commotion." "Are you a trapper then?" Fiona asked, curious about the man who had so dramatically entered her life. "Among other things," Xavier replied. "I hunt, trap, guide when someone needs it. Been thinking of trying my hand at ranching, but that takes more capital than I've managed to save." The kettle began to whistle, and Xavier busied himself preparing 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to Fiona, then sat in the chair opposite her. "What brings a Boston lady to Eldorado Canyon?" he asked, blowing steam from his mug. Fiona's eyebrows rose in surprise. "How did you know I'm from Boston?" Xavier's mouth quirked. "Your accent, and your boots, they're Eastern-made, fine quality but not suited for our winters." "You notice a great deal," Fiona observed, taking a careful sip of the strong, bitter tea. "Out here, noticing details keeps you alive," Xavier replied simply. Fiona nodded, understanding the truth in his words. "I came for the teaching position." There was an advertisement in a Boston paper. They needed someone with formal education to establish a proper school. "And that's all," Xavier pressed, his gaze surprisingly perceptive. "No other reason to leave civilization behind." Fiona hesitated, unused to such direct questioning from a stranger. Yet something about Xavier Zane's straightforward manner invited honesty. "I wanted something different," she admitted. "Something real. Boston is full of pretense and expectations. I grew tired of living according to others' rules." Xavier nodded slowly. "The West is certainly different," he acknowledged. Whether it's better depends on what you're looking for. And what brought you here, Mr. Zane? Fiona asked, turning the conversation away from herself. A shadow crossed Xavier's face. War, he said simply. After Appomattox, there wasn't much left for me back east. You fought for the Union? Fiona asked. Yes, Xavier confirmed, his tone making it clear he didn't wish to elaborate further. They fell into silence, sipping their tea as the fire crackled and popped. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the cabin, but inside was warmth and an unexpected sense of security. You should sleep, Xavier said eventually. Take the bed. I'll use my bedroll by the fire. Fiona started to protest, but Xavier raised a hand to stop her. No argument, he said firmly. You've been through an ordeal. Your body needs rest to recover from the cold. Too exhausted to insist otherwise, Fiona nodded gratefully. You're very kind, Mr. Zane. Xavier, he corrected. Out here, formality seems pointless. Xavier, Fiona repeated, testing the unusual name. Then you must call me Fiona. He nodded once, then busied himself arranging his bedroll while Fiona moved to the simple bed in the corner. Despite her exhaustion, she found herself watching him, the efficiency of his movements, the quiet strength evident in everything he did. Rest, Xavier said, catching her gaze. Tomorrow I'll take you into town. Fiona slipped under the covers, surrounded by the unfamiliar scent of pine, leather, and something uniquely masculine that she assumed was Xavier himself. As sleep claimed her, her last thought was of blue eyes and strong hands pulling her from the icy depths. Morning arrived with tentative rays of sunlight filtering through the cabin's single window. Fiona woke slowly, momentarily disoriented by her unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous day came rushing back: the cracking ice, the frigid water, the strong hands that had saved her. She sat up, looking around the cabin. Xavier was already awake, his bedroll neatly stowed. He stood at the small stove, frying something that filled the cabin with a mouth-watering aroma. "Good morning," he said without turning. "Your clothes should be dry." "Not entirely clean, but better than wearing mine into town." "Thank you," Fiona replied, suddenly self-conscious about her disheveled appearance. She ran a hand through her tangled chestnut hair, wishing for a brush. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash up," Xavier offered, as if reading her thoughts. "Food will be ready soon." Fiona gathered her now dry clothes and retreated behind a screen Xavier had thoughtfully set up in one corner. She changed quickly, grateful to be back in her own garments despite their wrinkled state. The cold water in the basin was bracing, but it helped clear the last vestiges of sleep from her mind. When she emerged, Xavier had set 2 plates on the table, each containing a generous portion of fried potatoes and venison. A pot of coffee sat between them. "It's not fancy," Xavier said as they sat down, "but it'll keep you going." "It looks wonderful," Fiona assured him, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Fiona found herself studying Xavier in the morning light. His features seemed less severe, though no less striking. His dark hair, slightly too long by Eastern standards, curled at the nape of his neck. The scar on his face caught the light, a silvery line against his tanned skin. "You're staring," Xavier observed without looking up from his plate. Fiona blushed, embarrassed to be caught. "I'm sorry. I wanted to thank you properly for yesterday." Xavier finally met her gaze. "You already did." "No, I mean." Fiona struggled to express herself. "What you did was extraordinary. You risked your life for a stranger." Xavier shrugged, uncomfortable with her praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," Fiona pointed out softly. "You did." A faint color rose in Xavier's cheeks, surprising Fiona. This man who had seemed so self-assured was apparently vulnerable to sincere gratitude. "We should head to town soon," he said, changing the subject. "Mayor Jenkins will be waiting for you, and I'm sure the town doctor will want to check you over after your ordeal." "Of course," Fiona agreed, recognizing his desire to move past the moment. "Is Eldorado Canyon far?" "About an hour's ride," Xavier replied, standing to clear their plates. "I've sent word ahead with a passing miner that you're safe. They'll be expecting us." Fiona helped him clean up, washing the dishes while Xavier packed a few items into a saddlebag. It struck her as oddly domestic, this morning routine with a man she'd only just met. Yet there was an ease between them that defied their brief acquaintance. Soon they were ready to depart. Xavier helped Fiona onto his horse before mounting behind her. Unlike the previous evening when survival had been her only concern, Fiona now felt acutely aware of his proximity. His chest pressed against her back, his arms encircling her to hold the reins. His warmth seeped through her clothes, and the faint scent of leather and pine that she'd noticed on his bedding was even more pronounced. "Comfortable?" Xavier asked, his breath stirring the hair near her ear. "Yes, thank you," Fiona replied, grateful he couldn't see her flushed cheeks. They set off, the horse picking its way carefully through the snow-covered landscape. The day was clear, the sky an impossible blue that reminded Fiona of Xavier's eyes. The sun glinted off the pristine snow, creating a dazzling tableau of white and gold. "It's beautiful," Fiona murmured, taking in the majestic mountains that surrounded them. "It is," Xavier agreed. "Dangerous too, as you discovered yesterday, but worth the risk, I think." "Is that why you stay?" Fiona asked, curious about this enigmatic man. "For the beauty." Xavier was quiet for so long that Fiona thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "After the war, everything back east seemed confined. Too many people, too many memories. Out here a man can breathe, can be judged by what he does, not where he came from or which side he fought for." "You fought for the Union," Fiona recalled. "I did," Xavier confirmed. "But it wasn't as simple as North and South, not for my family. My brother chose the Confederate side." "Oh," Fiona said softly, understanding the weight of his words. "Did he?" "Survive? Yes," Xavier said. "Though sometimes I wonder if either of us truly survived what we saw, what we did." The raw honesty in his voice touched Fiona deeply. This wasn't casual conversation. Xavier was sharing something fundamental about himself. "Is he out west too?" she asked. "No," Xavier replied. "He returned to our family home in Maryland, tried to rebuild what the war destroyed. And you came here instead." "I couldn't go back," Xavier said simply. "Not after everything. The West offered something I needed, a fresh start with no expectations." Fiona nodded, though he couldn't see the gesture. "That's not so different from my reasons." Xavier's arms tightened slightly around her, an acknowledgement of their shared understanding. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. As they crested a hill, Eldorado Canyon came into view below. It was larger than Fiona had expected, a proper town with several streets of buildings, not just the mining camp she had imagined. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from this distance, she could make out people moving about their business. "That's Eldorado," Xavier said unnecessarily. "Not San Francisco, but it's growing. The silver mines have been productive. It looks promising," Fiona said, trying to mask her nervousness about her new home. Xavier seemed to sense her anxiety. "The people are good," he assured her. "Rough around the edges, some of them, but decent at heart. They've been looking forward to having a proper school for their children." "And what do they think of having a woman teacher from the East?" Fiona asked, voicing a concern that had plagued her since accepting the position. They'll respect anyone who respects them, Xavier replied. Just don't try to make them into Easterners overnight, and you'll do fine. His confidence in her bolstered Fiona's spirits as they began their descent into the town that would be her new home. The main street of Eldorado Canyon was bustling with activity despite the winter weather. Miners in rough work clothes mingled with merchants and townspeople going about their daily business. Horses were tied outside the saloon and general store, stomping their hooves against the cold. Heads turned as Xavier guided his horse down the center of the street. Fiona felt the weight of curious stares, aware of how it must look her arriving in town on the same horse as the solitary trapper everyone knew as Xavier Zane. Xavier seemed oblivious to the attention, or perhaps simply indifferent to it. He reined his horse to a stop outside a two-story building with a sign identifying it as the mayor's office. "This is where the mayor works," Xavier explained, dismounting and reaching up to help Fiona down. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary before he stepped back. "He's also the town's lawyer and the closest thing to a welcoming committee you're likely to find." Before Fiona could respond, the door to the office swung open, and a portly man with impressive mutton chop whiskers hurried out, his face wreathed in smiles. "Miss Zimmerman," he exclaimed, extending his hand. "Thank the Lord you're safe. When we heard about the accident on the ice, we feared the worst." Fiona accepted his handshake. "I would have met the worst if not for Mr. Zane's timely intervention." The mayor turned to Xavier, his manner becoming slightly more reserved but no less respectful. "The town owes you a debt, Zane. Rescuing our new schoolteacher before she's even taught her first lesson." Xavier shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Right place, right time," he said simply. "Well, nonetheless, we're grateful," the mayor insisted before turning back to Fiona. "I'm Mayor Samuel Jenkins, Miss Zimmerman. We've been anticipating your arrival. The school building is all prepared, and several families have offered to host you until more permanent accommodations can be arranged." "That's very kind," Fiona said, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden shift from Xavier's quiet cabin to this bustling town and its expectations. Not at all," Jenkins assured her. "We're just pleased you've arrived safely, though a day's delay is nothing after your ordeal. Perhaps you'd like to rest today and begin your duties tomorrow." "That would be appreciated," Fiona admitted. "Excellent," Jenkins beamed. "Mrs. Patterson has prepared a room for you. She's the widow of our former assayer, a most respectable woman. Her home is just down the street." As the mayor continued detailing the arrangements, Fiona was aware of Xavier taking a step back, withdrawing from the conversation. She turned to look at him, a strange reluctance to part filling her. "Mr. Zane," she said, interrupting the mayor's monologue. "I cannot thank you enough for your assistance." Xavier nodded, his expression inscrutable. "You're welcome, Miss Zimmerman. I wish you luck with your teaching." There was a finality to his tone that suggested he considered their brief acquaintance concluded. Fiona felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "Perhaps I'll see you in town sometime," she suggested, unwilling to simply bid him farewell. A flicker of surprise crossed Xavier's face, followed by something that might have been pleasure. "Perhaps," he acknowledged. "Though I don't come to town often." "Well," Mayor Jenkins interjected, clearly eager to move on with showing Fiona her new home, "we must get you settled, Miss Zimmerman. Zane, you'll join us for the town meeting on Saturday. There's talk of expanding the Stagecoach service, which affects all of us in the area." Xavier hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be there." With that, he tipped his hat to Fiona, mounted his horse, and rode off down the street, leaving Fiona to watch his retreating figure with a mixture of gratitude and a strange sense of loss. The next few days passed in a whirlwind as Fiona settled into her new life in Eldorado Canyon. Mrs. Patterson proved to be a kind if somewhat overbearing hostess, feeding Fiona enormous meals and introducing her to what felt like every woman in town. The school building was small but well constructed, with fresh blackboards and enough desks for the 27 children who would be her students. On Friday, she conducted her first class. The children were a mixture of miners' offspring and the sons and daughters of the town's merchants and professionals. Some had received sporadic education before, others had never set foot in a classroom. All regarded her with a combination of curiosity and wariness that gradually gave way to engagement as she worked to make their lessons interesting and relevant to their lives. By the end of that first day, Fiona felt exhausted but exhilarated. This was why she had come west to make a difference, to build something meaningful. The children had responded well to her, and several parents had stopped by to thank her and express their support for the school. Yet despite her busy schedule and the general warmth of her welcome, Fiona found her thoughts returning repeatedly to Xavier Zane. Something about the solitary trapper had affected her deeply. Perhaps it was simply the dramatic circumstances of their meeting, or his unexpected kindness in her time of need. Whatever the reason, she found herself looking forward to the town meeting on Saturday, hoping to see him again. Saturday dawned clear and cold. Fiona dressed with more care than usual, selecting her best blue dress and arranging her hair in a neat bun. Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow at her efforts but made no comment as they walked together to the town hall. The large room was already crowded when they arrived. Most of the men stood at the back while the women occupied chairs near the front. Fiona's eyes scanned the gathering, searching for Xavier's tall figure among the crowd. "Looking for someone?" Mrs. Patterson asked, a knowing glint in her eye. "Just taking in the attendance," Fiona replied, embarrassed to be so transparent. Mrs. Patterson murmured, clearly unconvinced. "Well, if you're looking for that trapper who rescued you, he usually stands by the back wall. Keeps to himself, that one." Fiona's cheeks warmed at the older woman's perception, but she couldn't deny her interest. Following Mrs. Patterson's direction, she glanced toward the rear of the hall. And there he was, Xavier Zane, standing alone by the back wall, his tall frame unmistakable even among the other men. As if sensing her gaze, Xavier looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Fiona felt a jolt of recognition, of connection. Xavier's expression remained impassive, but he acknowledged her with a slight nod before returning his attention to Mayor Jenkins, who had begun to speak. The meeting covered various town matters: the expansion of the Stagecoach service, repairs needed for the bridge over Eldorado Creek, plans for a spring festival. Fiona tried to focus, but her awareness of Xavier's presence kept distracting her. When the formal meeting concluded, refreshments were served. This was the social portion of the gathering, where the real business of the town gossip, matchmaking, and informal negotiations took place. Fiona found herself surrounded by curious townspeople eager to meet the new schoolteacher. She answered their questions politely, all the while aware of Xavier still standing by the back wall, observing but not participating. Several times she thought he might be preparing to leave, and she found herself anxiously looking for a way to break free of her conversational obligations. Finally, after explaining her teaching philosophy to a particularly persistent mother for the third time, Fiona managed to excuse herself. She made her way through the crowd, nodding and smiling at those who greeted her, but moving purposefully toward the back of the room. Xavier watched her approach, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. "Mr. Zane," Fiona greeted him, suddenly uncertain now that she stood before him. "It's good to see you again." Miss Zimmerman, Xavier returned with a slight nod. You seem to be settling in well. Yes, everyone has been very welcoming, Fiona confirmed. The children are eager to learn and the parents supportive. Xavier nodded and an awkward silence fell between them. Fiona searched for something more meaningful to say. I wanted to thank you again, she began. You've thanked me enough, Xavier interrupted, though his tone was gentle. I did what anyone would do. I disagree, Fiona said, more boldly than she intended. Not everyone would have risked their life as you did, and not everyone would have shown such consideration afterward. Xavier looked uncomfortable with her praise. It was nothing, he insisted. It wasn't nothing to me, Fiona countered softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Fiona thought she glimpsed something beyond Xavier's carefully maintained reserve, a flicker of vulnerability, perhaps even longing. Before either could speak again, Mayor Jenkins appeared at Fiona's side. Ah, Miss Zimmerman, I see you found our resident hero again, Jenkins said jovially. Zane, what did you think of the proposal for the new stagecoach route? It would pass closer to your property, would it not? Xavier's expression closed off, his momentary openness vanishing. It would, he acknowledged. I have no objection. Excellent, excellent, Jenkins beamed. And Miss Zimmerman, Mrs. Thornton, was asking after you. She wants to discuss the possibility of music lessons for her daughters. Fiona recognized the gentle social maneuvering for what it was. A respectable woman like herself shouldn't spend too much time in conversation with a solitary man, especially one with Xavier's mysterious reputation. Of course, she said politely. I'll speak with her directly. She turned back to Xavier, reluctant to end their brief interaction. Perhaps I'll see you again soon, Mr. Zane. Xavier hesitated, then said quietly, I trap along Silver Creek. The eastern bank has raspberry bushes that should bear fruit come summer. Pleasant spot for a Sunday walk, if you're so inclined. With that cryptic remark, he nodded to Jenkins and made his way to the exit, leaving Fiona to wonder if she had just received a veiled invitation. The following day was Sunday, traditionally a day of rest and church attendance. Fiona dutifully accompanied Mrs. Patterson to the morning service at Eldorado's small but well-attended church. Throughout the sermon, her mind wandered to Xavier's parting words. Was he suggesting they meet, or merely pointing out a local attraction she might enjoy? After lunch, she announced her intention to take a walk. A walk, Mrs. Patterson repeated, eyebrows raised. It's quite cold out, dear. The fresh air will do me good, Fiona insisted. I've been indoors most of the week with the children. Mrs. Patterson looked skeptical but didn't object further. Be sure to bundle up and don't go too far. The weather can change quickly in these mountains. Fiona assured her she would be careful, then donned her warmest coat, gloves, and a woolen scarf. Silver Creek, she had learned, ran along the eastern edge of town before winding its way through the surrounding countryside. The eastern bank would take her away from town toward where Xavier Zane had his cabin. The winter landscape was breathtaking as Fiona made her way along the creek. Bare tree branches sparkled with frost, and the water rushed dark and swift between ice-encrusted banks. Despite the cold, the sun shone brightly, lending a crystalline quality to the scene. Fiona walked for nearly half an hour, beginning to think she had misinterpreted Xavier's words or perhaps missed the spot he'd mentioned. Just as she was considering turning back, she rounded a bend in the creek and saw a cluster of bare raspberry bushes on a small rise. And leaning against a nearby tree, waiting, was Xavier Zane. He straightened as she approached, his expression a mixture of surprise and what might have been pleasure. You came, he said simply. I wasn't sure if you meant it as an invitation, Fiona admitted, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. Neither was I, Xavier replied with unexpected honesty, "but I hoped you might." They stood for a moment, regarding each other in the winter sunlight. Xavier looked different outside of town, more relaxed, more himself. He wore a fringed buckskin jacket over dark trousers tucked into worn boots. His hat was pushed back slightly, allowing Fiona a clearer view of his face. "Would you walk with me?" Xavier asked, gesturing toward a path that followed the creek. "I'd like that," Fiona agreed. They fell into step beside each other, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. For a time they walked in silence, but it wasn't the awkward silence of their meeting in the town hall. This quiet felt companionable, comfortable. "How are you finding teaching?" Xavier finally asked. "Challenging," Fiona admitted, "but rewarding. The children have such different backgrounds and levels of previous education. Some can barely read while others are quite advanced for their age." "You'll manage it," Xavier said with a certainty that warmed her. "You have a way about you, steady but not rigid." "That's a very perceptive observation," Fiona noted, surprised by his insight. Xavier shrugged. "I watch people. Have to in my line of work." "You learn to read a person quickly when your life might depend on it." "And what do you rate in me?" Fiona asked, curious despite herself. Xavier glanced at her, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Someone who came west looking for more than just a teaching position. Someone with courage, who's not afraid to start over. Someone who might understand what it means to leave one life behind and build another." His assessment was so accurate it left Fiona momentarily speechless. "You see a great deal," she finally said. "Only what you show," Xavier replied. They walked further, coming to a fallen log beside the creek that had been cleared of snow. Xavier gestured for Fiona to sit, then joined her, keeping a respectful distance between them. "Why did you really leave Boston?" he asked, his gaze on the rushing water. Fiona considered deflecting the question, but found herself wanting to be honest with this man who had saved her life, and now seemed genuinely interested in understanding her. "My father died 2 years ago," she began. "He was a professor at Harvard, a good man, but very traditional. My mother had passed many years before. After father's death, my older brother expected me to either marry quickly or live as his dependent, helping his wife with their children." "Neither option appealed to you," Xavier guessed. "No," Fiona confirmed. "I had my teaching certificate. I'd worked as a governess and then as an assistant in a girls' school. I wanted more than the narrow life my brother envisioned for me." "So you answered an advertisement for a position across the country," Xavier concluded. "Yes," Fiona said with a small smile. "My brother was scandalized. He called it a wild, improper adventure." "And has it been?" Xavier asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "A wild adventure? Well, I nearly drowned in a frozen lake within sight of my destination," Fiona pointed out dryly. "I'd call that fairly wild." Xavier's laugh surprised her, deep and genuine, transforming his serious face. "Fair point," he conceded, "though that's not typical, even for the West." Their conversation flowed easily after that. Xavier told her more about his life as a trapper and hunter, about the seasons in the mountains and the animals he tracked. Fiona shared stories of her students and her impressions of Eldorado Canyon. They discovered a shared love of reading. Xavier kept a small but eclectic library in his cabin, books being one of the few luxuries he allowed himself. The winter sun began to dip toward the mountains, reminding Fiona that she should return to town before dark. "I should go back," she said reluctantly. "Mrs. Patterson will worry." Xavier nodded, standing to offer her his hand. As she took it and rose, Fiona was acutely aware of his touch, warm and strong even through their gloves. "May I walk you back?" Xavier asked, still holding her hand. "Won't that cause talk?" Fiona asked, though she didn't withdraw her hand. "Probably," Xavier acknowledged. Does that concern you? Fiona considered the question seriously. Her reputation as the schoolteacher was important, yet she was unwilling to pretend she didn't enjoy Xavier's company simply to avoid gossip. Let them talk, she decided. You saved my life. Surely I'm allowed to walk with you occasionally. Xavier's smile was quick and genuine. Occasionally, he repeated. Does that mean you'd be willing to meet again? I would, Fiona confirmed, feeling a flutter of anticipation at the prospect. They walked back toward town side by side, close but not touching, their conversation continuing easily. As they neared the outskirts of Eldorado Canyon, Xavier slowed his pace. This is probably far enough, he said. No need to set the gossips' tongues wagging more than necessary. Fiona knew he was right, but felt a pang of disappointment nonetheless. Will I see you next Sunday? She asked boldly. If you wish it, Xavier replied, his eyes holding hers. I do, Fiona said simply. Xavier nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Until Sunday, then. He tipped his hat to her and turned back toward the creek, leaving Fiona to watch him go before making her own way into town. True to his word, Xavier met Fiona by the raspberry bushes the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. These weekly walks quickly became the highlight of Fiona's life in Eldorado Canyon. Away from the prying eyes of the townspeople, she and Xavier could speak freely, learning each other's histories, thoughts, and dreams. February gave way to March, and the first hints of spring began to appear in the mountain landscape. The snow receded from the lower elevations, and tiny green shoots appeared on the raspberry bushes. Xavier showed Fiona how to identify animal tracks, how to spot the first wildflowers emerging from the snow, how to read the weather in the patterns of clouds. In turn, Fiona shared her knowledge of literature and science, topics Xavier had studied independently but never formally. She brought books from the small town library to their Sunday meetings, and they sometimes spent hours discussing a particularly interesting passage or debating philosophical questions raised by the authors. As the weeks passed, Fiona became increasingly aware of her growing feelings for Xavier. His initial reserve had gradually melted away, revealing a man of deep intelligence, quiet humor, and surprising tenderness. She found herself thinking of him throughout the week, looking forward to their meetings with an eagerness that sometimes alarmed her. Yet despite their obvious connection, Xavier maintained a certain distance. His gaze might linger on her face, his hand occasionally brush hers as they walked, but he made no declaration, sought no formal understanding between them. Sometimes Fiona wondered if she had imagined the attraction she felt growing between them. By early April, the gossip in town about their Sunday walks had become impossible to ignore. Mrs. Patterson made increasingly pointed remarks about suitable companions for a schoolteacher. Several of the miners' wives exchanged knowing glances when Fiona mentioned anything related to the wilderness or hunting. Even Mayor Jenkins had taken to giving her concerned looks when Xavier's name arose in conversation. One Thursday evening in mid-April, as Fiona was preparing to leave the schoolhouse, she found Mayor Jenkins waiting outside. "Miss Zimmerman," he greeted her, his usual joviality somewhat subdued. "Might I have a word?" "Of course, Mayor," Fiona replied, her heart sinking as she suspected the topic of conversation. Jenkins escorted her a short distance from the school, clearly wanting privacy for whatever he had to say. "Miss Zimmerman," he began hesitantly, "you've been an excellent addition to our community. The children are thriving under your instruction, and the parents are universally pleased with your methods." "Thank you," Fiona said cautiously. "I'm glad to hear it." "Yes, well," Jenkins continued, clearing his throat uncomfortably, It's precisely because of your value to the community that I feel compelled to speak with you about a matter of reputation." "My reputation?" Fiona asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "Your association with Xavier Zane," Jenkins clarified. "While we're all grateful for his heroic rescue of you, and while he is certainly a respected member of the wider community, well, he's not the sort of companion typically deemed suitable for a lady in your position." Fiona felt a flash of indignation. "Mr. Zane is a gentleman of intelligence and integrity," she said firmly. "I see nothing unsuitable in our occasional walks." Jenkins sighed. "I understand your perspective, Miss Zimmerman. Truly I do. Zane is indeed an honorable man in his way. But he's also a loner, a man with a past he rarely discusses." "There are rumors I have no interest in hearing," Fiona interrupted, more sharply than she'd intended. "Nevertheless," Jenkins pressed on, "as mayor, I must consider the welfare of the entire community. The school board has expressed concern. They fear that your continued friendship with Zane may eventually lead parents to question your judgment." "That's absurd," Fiona protested. "My teaching abilities have nothing to do with whom I choose to walk with on my day off. In a small town like Eldorado, everything is connected," Jenkins explained gently. "Fair or not, that's the reality." Fiona took a deep breath, struggling to maintain her composure. "What exactly are you asking of me, Mayor Jenkins?" Jenkins looked relieved that she had cut to the heart of the matter. "The board would prefer that you limit your interactions with Zane to public group settings. No more private Sunday walks." "Or," Fiona prompted, hearing the implicit threat. Jenkins had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Or they may need to reconsider the terms of your employment when the school year ends in June." Fiona felt as though she'd been slapped. The unfairness of it burned in her chest. "I see," she said coldly. "Thank you for making the situation clear, Mayor Jenkins. I'll need time to consider my response." Jenkins nodded, clearly relieved the conversation was concluding. Of course. Take all the time you need. Just, perhaps postpone this Sunday's walk while you deliberate." Without waiting for her answer, he tipped his hat and hurried away, leaving Fiona standing alone outside the schoolhouse, her thoughts in turmoil. That night, sleep eluded her. She paced her small room at Mrs. Patterson's house, weighing her options. She loved her work at the school. The children needed her, and she had begun to implement programs that were making a real difference in their education. To abandon that work would be a serious sacrifice. Yet the thought of giving up her friendship with Xavier and the possibility that it might develop into something more was equally painful. In their conversations by Silver Creek, she had found an intellectual equal, and a man whose quiet strength and hidden depths fascinated her. The connection between them felt rare and precious. By morning, Fiona had reached a decision. After school on Friday, she wrote a brief note and asked one of her older students, a reliable boy whose family lived near Silver Creek, to deliver it to Xavier's cabin. The note contained just a few lines, asking Xavier to meet her at their usual spot an hour earlier than normal on Sunday. Sunday dawned clear and mild, the spring sunshine warming the mountain landscape. Fiona dressed with care, selecting a simple but becoming green dress that Xavier had once commented brought out the color of her eyes. She left Mrs. Patterson's house claiming a headache that prevented her from attending church, then made her way to Silver Creek once the town was occupied with the morning service. Xavier was already waiting when she arrived, his tall figure silhouetted against the greening landscape. As she approached, Fiona noted that he too had dressed with more care than usual, wearing a clean shirt and his best coat. "You're early," Xavier observed, though her note had specified the earlier meeting time. I needed to speak with you privately, without worrying about getting back to town too late," Fiona explained. Something in her tone must have alerted Xavier to the seriousness of the situation. His expression grew concerned as he gestured toward their usual log by the creek. Once they were seated, Fiona turned to face him directly. "Mayor Jenkins spoke to me on Thursday," she began, "about our Sunday walks." Xavier's jaw tightened. "I suspected this might happen eventually. He informed me that the school board disapproves of our association," Fiona continued, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. "They've implied that my position may be at risk if I continue to see you privately." Xavier's expression darkened. "They have no right," he began, then stopped himself. After a moment, he asked more calmly, "What do you intend to do?" Fiona took a deep breath. "That depends in part on you." "On me," Xavier repeated, clearly surprised. "Yes," Fiona confirmed, gathering her courage. "These past months, getting to know you has been important to me." "More than important, but I need to know if I'm alone in feeling that way." Xavier looked at her intently, his blue eyes searching her face. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "Not at all." Hope bloomed in Fiona's chest. "Then I need to know what you want, Xavier. Because if these walks, these conversations, are all you seek from me, then perhaps it would be wiser to respect the board's wishes. But if you want more, if you feel as I do, then I'm prepared to fight for that, regardless of the consequences." Xavier stood abruptly, taking a few steps away from the log. His back to her, he ran a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of frustration. "It's not that simple, Fiona," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Why not?" Fiona challenged, rising to face him as he turned back toward her. "Because I have nothing to offer you," Xavier said bluntly. "I'm a trapper, a hunter. I live in a one-room cabin miles from town. You're educated, refined. You deserve better than a life of hardship with a man haunted by war." "Shouldn't that be my decision?" Fiona asked softly. "What I deserve, what I want." "You don't understand what you're saying," Xavier insisted. "The life I lead, I understand perfectly," Fiona interrupted. "I came west seeking authenticity, seeking a life that meant something real. I found purpose in my teaching, yes. But I found something else too, something I wasn't looking for but now can't imagine living without." She took a step closer to him, close enough to see the conflict in his eyes, the longing he tried to suppress. "I found you, Xavier," she said simply. "And I don't want to lose you because of narrow-minded gossip or your own misguided notion of what's best for me." Xavier stood very still, his gaze never leaving her face. Then, slowly, he raised a hand to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "I've been fighting this since the day I pulled you from that stagecoach," he admitted, his voice low. "Telling myself it was impossible that you would eventually see me for what I am and turn away." "And what are you?" Fiona asked, leaning slightly into his touch. "A broken man," Xavier said honestly. "Changed by war, by loss, not the kind of man a woman like you should tie herself to." "You're wrong," Fiona said firmly. "I see you clearly, Xavier Zane. I see your strength, your intelligence, your compassion. I see the man who risked his life for a stranger, who treats everyone with respect regardless of their station, who loves books and ideas and the wild beauty of these mountains." Xavier's hand trembled against her cheek. "Fiona," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "Are you certain? Truly certain? Because once I stop fighting this, I don't think I can go back." In answer, Fiona placed her hand over his, holding it against her face. "I've never been more certain of anything," she whispered. The barrier that had held Xavier back finally crumbled. He drew her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened into something that left them both breathless. Fiona wound her arms around his neck, pressing herself closer, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against her chest. When they finally broke apart, Xavier rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since the moment I saw you through that stagecoach window, your eyes wide with fear but still full of determination." "I love you too," Fiona replied, the words coming easily, naturally. "Enough to face whatever consequences come from this." Xavier straightened, his expression resolute. "You won't face them alone," he promised. "If the school board wants to dismiss you for associating with me, then they'll have to deal with us both." "What do you mean?" Fiona asked, curious about the determination in his voice. "I mean," Xavier said, taking her hands in his, "that I intend to speak with Mayor Jenkins tomorrow. To make my intentions clear and honorable." "Your intentions," Fiona repeated, her heart quickening. "To court you properly," Xavier clarified. "With the town's knowledge and hopefully their blessing, and if they cannot give it." He hesitated, then continued more firmly, "If they cannot accept us together, then perhaps Eldorado Canyon isn't where we're meant to be." "You would leave?" Fiona asked, surprised. "This has been your home for years." "Home is not a place," Xavier said softly. "I've learned that the hard way. Home is where you can be true to yourself, with people who accept you as you are. I've found that with you, Fiona. The rest is just geography." Fiona felt tears spring to her eyes at his words. "I don't want you to have to choose between your home and me." "I'm not choosing," Xavier assured her. "I'm just acknowledging what I already know, that my life is better with you in it, wherever that might be." He kissed her again, sealing his declaration, and Fiona melted into his embrace, the worries about her position temporarily forgotten in the joy of his newfound openness. When they parted, Xavier kept his arm around her waist as they walked slowly back along the creek. "We should return to town," he said reluctantly, "and face whatever comes together." "Together," Fiona agreed, leaning against his solid strength. The path ahead might not be easy, but with Xavier beside her, she felt ready to face whatever challenges awaited them in Eldorado Canyon. True to his word, Xavier rode into town early Monday morning and went directly to Mayor Jenkins's office. Fiona, teaching her class at the schoolhouse, couldn't help glancing repeatedly toward the window, wondering what was transpiring across the street. Xavier found Jenkins at his desk, reviewing mining claims. The mayor looked up in surprise at the trapper's entrance, clearly unaccustomed to seeing Xavier Zane voluntarily appear in his office. "Zane," Jenkins greeted him cautiously. "What can I do for you? I understand you spoke with Miss Zimmerman regarding our friendship," Xavier said without preamble. Jenkins sighed, setting down his papers. "I did," he confirmed. "As mayor, it's my responsibility to—" "I'm not here to debate your responsibilities," Xavier interrupted. "I'm here to inform you of my intentions toward Miss Zimmerman." Jenkins raised his eyebrows. "Your intentions?" "I intend to court her properly," Xavier stated firmly, "with the knowledge and, I hope, the blessing of this community." Jenkins leaned back in his chair, studying the tall man before him. "Court her," he repeated thoughtfully. "With an eye toward marriage, yes," Xavier confirmed without hesitation. "I see." Jenkins drummed his fingers on his desk, considering. "That does alter the situation somewhat. A proper courtship, conducted openly and with honorable intent, would certainly be viewed differently by the board than clandestine meetings." "There was nothing clandestine about our walks," Xavier pointed out, an edge to his voice. "Perhaps not," Jenkins conceded. "But perception matters in a small community like ours." "And how would the community perceive a formal courtship?" Xavier pressed. Jenkins considered the question carefully before responding. "There would be talk, certainly. Some would approve, others wouldn't. But if your intentions are honorable, and if Miss Zimmerman continues to perform her duties as admirably as she has thus far. He spread his hands. I believe the board could be persuaded to take no further action regarding her position. Xavier nodded, satisfied with this assessment. Good. Because Miss Zimmerman is an exceptional teacher and this town would be foolish to lose her over gossip and narrow-mindedness. Jenkins smiled slightly. On that, we agree completely. He stood, extending his hand across the desk. You have my support, Zane, for whatever that's worth. Xavier accepted the handshake, somewhat surprised by the mayor's easy acquiescence. Thank you, he said simply. As Xavier turned to leave, Jenkins added, She's changed you, you know, for the better, I think. Xavier paused at the door, considering this observation. Perhaps, he acknowledged. Or perhaps she simply helped me remember who I was before the war. With that, he departed, leaving Jenkins thoughtfully stroking his mutton chop whiskers. Word of Xavier's visit to the mayor spread through Eldorado Canyon with remarkable speed. By the time Fiona dismissed her class that afternoon, she was aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed her through town. Mrs. Patterson met her at the door with raised eyebrows and a flurry of questions that Fiona deflected as gently as possible. That evening, a knock at Mrs. Patterson's front door revealed Xavier, hatless and bearing a small bouquet of early spring wildflowers. Mrs. Patterson, for once, seemed at a loss for words as she admitted him to the parlor where Fiona waited, her heart racing at this public declaration of his intentions. Miss Zimmerman, Xavier greeted her formally, though his eyes conveyed a warmth that was for her alone. I wondered if you might permit me to escort you to dinner at the hotel restaurant this evening. Fiona accepted the flowers with a smile that matched the brightness in her eyes. I would be delighted, Mr. Zane. And so began their official courtship, conducted under the watchful eyes of Eldorado Canyon. Xavier called at Mrs. Patterson's house 3 evenings a week. They attended church together on Sundays, followed by dinner with various town families who, seeing the mayor's tacit approval, had begun to extend invitations to the unlikely couple. Their Sunday walks continued, though now they were no secret. Sometimes they were joined by others' children from Fiona's class curious about the forest, or townspeople who suddenly discovered an interest in the natural world. But often they were allowed the privacy that had become precious to them, walking hand in hand along Silver Creek, talking and dreaming together. Spring advanced into early summer, and with it came the end of the school year. The school board, far from dismissing Fiona, offered her a renewed contract with a modest increase in salary. The threat that had once loomed over her happiness with Xavier had dissipated in the face of their open courtship and the community's gradual acceptance. One warm evening in late June, Xavier took Fiona on a ride into the mountains. They traveled on horseback, Fiona now comfortable enough on her own mount after weeks of Xavier's patient instruction. He led her to a high meadow ablaze with wildflowers, a clear stream running along one edge and the breathtaking panorama of the surrounding peaks spread before them. It's beautiful, Fiona breathed, dismounting to wade through knee-high grasses dotted with blue, yellow, and purple blossoms. I found it my first year here, Xavier explained, securing their horses before joining her. I come back every summer when the flowers bloom. I've never brought anyone else. Fiona turned to him, touched by the significance of his sharing this special place. Thank you for bringing me, she said softly. Xavier took her hands in his expression serious. I brought you here for a reason, Fiona. Her heart began to race as he continued, These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You've brought light back into a world that had grown dark for me. You've helped me remember who I was before the war and shown me who I could be now with you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. Opening it, he revealed a ring, a simple gold band set with a modestly sized diamond that caught the evening light. "I've been saving for this since before I knew you," Xavier admitted, "hoping that someday I might find someone to share my life with, though I'd nearly given up hope." Kneeling before her in the meadow of wildflowers, Xavier held the ring up, his blue eyes never leaving hers. "Fiona Zimmerman, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy blurred Fiona's vision as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Xavier. I would be proud to be your wife." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to take her in his arms. Their kiss was tender and promising, sealing the commitment they had just made to each other. When they finally broke apart, Xavier kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "There's something else I want to show you," he said. "Another reason I brought you here today." Taking her hand, he led her to the edge of the meadow where the land sloped gently down toward a small, sheltered valley. There, nestled among a stand of pines, was a half-built cabin larger than Xavier's current home, with a stone foundation already laid and the framework of walls beginning to rise. "What is this?" Fiona asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "Our home," Xavier said simply. "If you approve." "I've been working on it whenever I could get away without raising your suspicions." Fiona walked slowly toward the structure, taking in the details: the large windows that would let in abundant light, the stone chimney that would warm them through winter nights, the extra rooms that spoke of Xavier's hope for a family. "It's perfect," she said, turning back to him with shining eyes. "When did you start building it?" "The day after I spoke to Jenkins," Xavier admitted. "I wanted to have something more to offer you than my old cabin." "Your old cabin would have been enough," Fiona assured him, touched by his efforts. "As long as we were together." "I know," Xavier said, drawing her close again. "That's one of the countless reasons I love you, but I wanted to build something new, something that would be ours from the beginning." Fiona looked around the serene valley, imagining their life together in this beautiful, wild place. "How far is it from town?" she asked practically. "I'll need to reach the school." "About 2 miles, Xavier replied. "An easy ride in good weather, and I thought—" He hesitated, then continued, "I thought perhaps, in time, we might establish a small school here as well, for the outlying families who can't easily reach town, if you were interested." Fiona's heart swelled at his thoughtfulness, at how perfectly he understood her passion for teaching. "I would love that," she said sincerely. They spent the remaining daylight exploring the site of their future home, Xavier explaining his plans for each room, Fiona offering suggestions that he eagerly incorporated. As the sun began to set, turning the distant mountains to gold and purple, they sat together on a fallen log, arms entwined, contemplating the life they would build together. "When shall we be married?" Xavier asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Soon," Fiona replied without hesitation. "Before the new school year begins in September. That would give us time for a brief honeymoon before my teaching duties resume." "August, then," Xavier suggested, "when the wildflowers are still in bloom." Fiona nodded, leaning into his embrace. "August it is." The news of their engagement spread through Eldorado Canyon with predictable speed. Most reactions were positive. The townspeople had grown accustomed to the sight of the schoolteacher and the trapper together, and Xavier's evident devotion to Fiona had softened even the most skeptical hearts. Mrs. Patterson, after an initial period of concern about Fiona burying herself in the wilderness, became an enthusiastic supporter of the match. She took it upon herself to organize a proper wedding celebration, enlisting the help of the town's other prominent women. Mayor Jenkins offered the use of the town hall for the ceremony and subsequent reception, an offer the couple gratefully accepted. The local minister, who had watched their courtship unfold during Sunday services, agreed to officiate. Throughout July and early August, preparations for the wedding occupied much of the town's attention. Women sewed a wedding dress for Fiona, men contributed to the completion of the new cabin, and children gathered wildflowers to decorate the town hall. Xavier continued to work on their home, determined to have it ready for occupancy after their honeymoon. Fiona divided her time between helping with wedding preparations and assisting Xavier whenever possible, learning the practical skills of frontier life that would serve her in their future together. On the morning of August 12, 1876, Fiona stood in Mrs. Patterson's guest room, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant ivory silk with modest lace trim, sewn by the women of Eldorado Canyon as a gift to their beloved teacher. Her chestnut hair was arranged in a coronet of braids, intertwined with tiny white flowers. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, entering the room with misty eyes. "Xavier is a fortunate man indeed." "I'm the fortunate one," Fiona replied softly, thinking of the journey that had brought her to this day from a sheltered life in Boston to the edge of the wilderness, from a near-death experience in a frozen lake to the love of a remarkable man. "It's time, Mrs. Patterson announced, offering Fiona a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the meadow where Xavier had proposed. "Everyone is waiting." The town hall had been transformed. Wildflowers and pine boughs decorated every available surface, their fresh scent filling the air. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the assembled townspeople who rose as Fiona entered. At the far end of the hall stood Xavier, more handsome than Fiona had ever seen him in a new black suit, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. The scar on his cheek gleamed silver in the lantern light, a reminder of the hardships he had endured before finding her. But it was his eyes that captured Fiona's attention, blue and bright with love, as they followed her progress down the makeshift aisle. Mayor Jenkins escorted her, having offered to stand in for her absent father. When they reached Xavier, Jenkins placed Fiona's hand in his with a smile of genuine approval before stepping aside. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises to support each other's dreams, to face life's challenges together, to build a home filled with love and learning. Xavier's voice was steady as he pledged himself to her. Fiona's trembled slightly with emotion. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier drew Fiona into a kiss that managed to be both respectful of their audience and deeply expressive of his feelings for her. The townspeople erupted in cheers and applause, genuinely happy for the couple who had overcome social expectations and initial disapproval to find love. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. There was dancing to the music of local fiddles, a feast prepared by the town's best cooks, and toasts to the health and happiness of the newlyweds. Xavier, normally reserved in social situations, surprised everyone with his attentive hosting and even joined Fiona for several dances, revealing a grace that belied his frontier appearance. As midnight approached, they slipped away from the continuing celebration, mounting horses decorated with flowers and ribbons by the schoolchildren. Amid good-natured teasing and a shower of rice, they rode out of town toward the cabin by Silver Creek, where their relationship had begun, Xavier's original home, which would shelter them until their new cabin was complete. The following week was a honeymoon of sorts, though not the traditional kind. They spent their days working together on their new home, Xavier teaching Fiona the basics of cabin construction. In the evenings, they returned to the small cabin by Silver Creek, where they discovered the deeper intimacies of marriage, learning each other's bodies with the same curiosity and respect with which they had learned each other's minds. By the time September arrived and the new school year began, they had moved into their larger cabin in the mountain meadow. It wasn't entirely finished. Some interior work remained for the coming winter evenings, but it was comfortable, and more importantly, it was theirs. Fiona rode to town each morning to teach, returning each afternoon to the home she shared with Xavier. Some evenings, he accompanied her back to town for social engagements. Others, they spent quietly together, reading aloud from their growing library or simply talking by the fire. On weekends, they explored the surrounding wilderness, Xavier teaching Fiona the skills she would need to thrive in their mountain home. As autumn painted the landscape in brilliant colors and the first snows threatened, Fiona and Xavier settled into the rhythm of their shared life. They began planning for the small outlying school Xavier had suggested, identifying nearby families whose children struggled to reach town regularly. Fiona designed a curriculum while Xavier started construction on a simple one-room schoolhouse adjacent to their home. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing their meadow in snow by late October. Xavier had prepared well, stocking their cabin with firewood and preserves to see them through the coldest months. The memory of Fiona's near drowning made them both cautious about crossing frozen water, but otherwise they embraced the winter's beauty, snowshoeing through glittering forests and spending cozy evenings by their hearth. One such evening in early December, as they sat reading by the fire, Fiona set aside her book with a thoughtful expression. "Xavier," she said, drawing his attention from his own reading, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" he asked, marking his place and giving her his full attention. "You remember when we talked about building a life together, about what that might include?" Fiona asked, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. Xavier nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he anticipated her meaning. "I remember. We mentioned children," Fiona continued, "how we both wanted a family someday." "We did," Xavier confirmed, his eyes now fixed intently on her face. "Are you suggesting that someday might be approaching?" Fiona's smile bloomed fully. "Not approaching," she corrected gently. "Arrived. I'm quite certain that I'm with child." Xavier was across the room in an instant, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands in his. "A baby," he said, wonder and joy mingling in his voice. "Our baby." "Due in summer, I think," Fiona said, "around the time of our first anniversary." Xavier placed a hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "Are you happy about this?" he asked, searching her face. "It's happening sooner than we planned." "I'm overjoyed," Fiona assured him, "though I admit to some nervousness. We're rather isolated here, especially in winter." "We'll be prepared," Xavier promised. "I'll make sure of it, and by summer the roads will be clear for the doctor to reach us if needed." He rose, pulling Fiona to her feet and into his arms. "A family," he murmured against her hair. "Something I never thought I'd have after the war." "You've given me so much, Fiona." "We've given each other a new beginning," she corrected, lifting her face for his kiss. "And now we're giving that same gift to our child." The months that followed were busy ones. Xavier worked through the winter to complete their home and the small schoolhouse, adding a nursery adjacent to their bedroom. When spring arrived, bringing with it easier travel, he journeyed to the nearest large town to purchase supplies for the baby: a cradle, soft blankets, and the medical necessities that might be required for the birth. Fiona continued teaching in town until late May, when her advancing pregnancy and the difficulty of the daily ride led her to accept a temporary replacement for the remainder of the term. Instead, she focused on establishing the small outlying school at their home. By June, 5 children from nearby homesteads were coming regularly for lessons, and Fiona found this more intimate teaching setting deeply rewarding. As her due date approached, the women of Eldorado Canyon took turns visiting, bringing gifts for the baby and offering advice to the first-time mother. Mrs. Patterson practically moved in for the last 2 weeks, determined that her former boarder should have proper female assistance when her time came. On the morning of August 10, 1877, 2 days before their first wedding anniversary, Fiona went into labor. Xavier sent one of the older boys from a neighboring homestead to fetch the town doctor, then settled in to support his wife through the birth of their child. The labor was long but uncomplicated. Throughout the day and into the evening, Xavier remained by Fiona's side, holding her hand, bathing her forehead with cool water, and murmuring encouragement as she worked to bring their child into the world. The doctor arrived just in time to assist with the final stages. Shortly after midnight, as August 10th became August 11th, a lusty cry announced the arrival of their son. Xavier cradled the newborn with tears in his eyes while the doctor attended to Fiona. "He's perfect," Xavier whispered, bringing the swaddled infant to Fiona's side. "Strong and healthy, just like his mother." Fiona reached out to touch her son's tiny face, overwhelmed by the love that flooded her heart. "What shall we name him?" she asked, though they had discussed possibilities for months. Xavier gazed down at the baby, then at his exhausted but radiant wife. "James," he suggested. "After my brother, if that's all right with you." Fiona nodded, understanding the significance of the name and the healing it represented for Xavier. "James Xavier Zane," she pronounced. "A good, strong name for a boy who will grow up in these mountains." Xavier leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Thank you," he said simply, the words encompassing gratitude not just for her acceptance of the name, but for everything she had brought into his life. The following day, as Fiona rested with baby James, Xavier stood on the porch of their cabin, gazing out at the wildflower meadow now in full summer bloom. The small schoolhouse stood nearby, ready to welcome students again once Fiona had recovered. Their home was complete, warm and inviting, filled with books and handcrafted furniture, and now, the soft sounds of their newborn son. He thought back to that winter day 18 months earlier, when he'd been riding back from checking his traps and had heard the commotion on Miller's Lake. How close he had come to missing that moment, to riding on without investigating. How different his life would have been if he hadn't seen the stagecoach sink through the ice, hadn't broken that window and pulled Fiona to safety. The door opened behind him, and Mrs. Patterson stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. "Fiona's asking for you," she said with a smile. "That boy of yours is hungry again." Xavier thanked her and went inside to his family. Fiona sat propped up in bed, their son cradled in her arms, her face tired but peaceful. She looked up as Xavier entered, her smile as bright as it had been the day he'd proposed in the wildflower meadow. "There you are," she said softly. "We were missing you." Xavier sat beside her on the bed, slipping an arm around her shoulders and reaching out to touch his son's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around his father's thumb, a grip surprisingly strong for one so small. "I was just thinking," Xavier said, pressing a kiss to Fiona's temple, "about how fortunate we are." "Because of James?" Fiona asked, smiling down at their son. "Because of everything," Xavier clarified. "Because a stagecoach fell through ice with you inside and I happened to be riding by to pull you out." Fiona leaned against him, understanding perfectly what he meant. Some might call it chance, she mused, or luck. And what would you call it? Xavier asked, curious about her perspective. Fiona considered for a moment, watching their son's peaceful face as he nursed. Destiny, perhaps, she finally said. Or simply love finding its way to us through ice and fear and all the expectations that might have kept us apart. Xavier nodded, satisfied with her answer. As the summer sun streamed through the windows of the home they had built together, illuminating this perfect moment of peace and family, he silently thanked whatever force had led him to that frozen lake on that winter day, allowing him to break through ice and glass to find the woman who had melted the frozen places in his heart. Outside, the wildflowers swayed in the gentle mountain breeze, the stream burbled its endless song, and life in all its unexpected beauty continued to unfold, promising winters and springs yet to come, challenges and joys to be faced together, and love always loved to light their way forward.